Pause. Warden. But I never doubt my victory. Only sometimes I'm afraid the Duke will let me slip through his fingers and forget that he's fighting. Prince. And when do you win? Warden. At dawn. Then he throws me down and spits at me. That's his confession of defeat. But I have to go on lying there for an hour before I can get my breath back properly. Pause. Prince, standing up. But tell me, don't you know what they really want? Warden. To get out of the park. Prince. But why? Warden. That I don't know. Prince. Haven't you asked? Warden. No. Prince. Why not? Warden. It would embarrass me. But if you wish, I'll ask them today. Prince, shocked, loud, today. Warden. Knowingly, yes, today. Prince. And you can't even guess what they want. Warden, thoughtfully, no. Pause. Warden. Perhaps I ought to add that sometimes in the early mornings while I'm lying there trying to get my breath and even too weak to open my eyes, there comes a delicate, moist creature, rather hairy to the touch, a latecomer, the Countess Isabella. She runs her hand all over me, catches hold of my beard, her whole body glides along my neck, under my chin, and she's in the habit of saying, "Not the others, but me, let me out." I shake my head as much as I can. I want to go to Prince Leo to offer him my hand. I keep on shaking my head. But me. I can still hear her crying, then she's gone. And my granddaughter appears with blankets, wraps me up in them, and waits with me till I can walk on my own. An exceptionally good girl. Prince. Isabella? The name's unknown to me. Pause. Prince. To offer me her hand. Goes to window, looks out. Enter servant through center door. Servant. Her Highness, Milady the Princess, awaits you. Prince, looks absent-mindedly at servant. Turns to warden, wait till I come back. Exit left. Chamberlain enters at once through center door, then the Lord High Steward, youngish man in officer's uniform, through door on right. Warden. Ducks behind divan and flourishes his hands as though seeing ghosts. Steward. The prince has gone? Chamberlain. Following your advice, the princess sent for him. Steward. Good. Turns suddenly, bends over behind divan. And you, miserable ghost, you actually dared to appear here in the princely castle. Aren't you afraid of the great boot that'll kick you through the door? Warden. I'm. Steward. Quiet. First of all keep quiet, don't utter, and sit down here in this corner. To Chamberlain. I thank you for informing me about the latest princely whim. Chamberlain. You inquired about it. Steward. Even so. And now a confidential word. Purposely in front of that creature there. You, Count, are flirting with the opposition. Chamberlain. Is that an accusation? Steward. An apprehension, so far. Chamberlain. In that case I can answer. I'm not flirting with the opposition, for I don't know it. I can feel the currents, but I steer clear of them. I still represent the open policy that prevailed under Duke Friedrich. At that time the only policy at court was to serve the prince. This was made easier by his being a bachelor, but it should never be difficult. Steward. Very sensible, except that one's own nose, however reliable, never points the right way all the time. This can only be achieved by reason. But reason must make decisions. Let's assume the prince is on the wrong track. Does one serve him better by following him down or, with all due respect, by chasing him back? Undoubtedly by chasing him back. Chamberlain. You came here with the princess from a foreign court, have spent a mere 6 months here, and you already think you can tell the difference between good and evil in the complicated conditions of this court? Steward. He who blinks sees only complications. He who keeps his eyes open sees the eternal truth in the first hours as clearly as after 100 years. Admittedly, in this case, a sad truth which in the next few days, however, may take a decisive turn for the better. Chamberlain. I cannot believe that the decision which you wish to bring about and which I know only from your announcement will be a good one. I'm afraid you misunderstand our prince, the court, and everything here. Steward. Whether understood or misunderstood, the present situation is unbearable. Chamberlain. Unbearable it may be, but it is founded on the nature of things as they are here, and we are prepared to bear it to the end. Steward. But not the princess, not I, not those who are on our side. Chamberlain. What do you find so unbearable? Steward. Just because the decision is imminent I want to speak frankly. The prince has a dual nature. The one, concerning itself with government, wavers absent-mindedly in public, disregarding its own privileges. The other nature admittedly searches very painstakingly for a strengthening of its foundations. It searches for them in the past, delving deeper and deeper. What a misunderstanding of the situation. A misunderstanding that doesn't lack greatness, although its defectiveness is even greater than its appearance. Can you fail to see that? Chamberlain. It's not the description I object to, it's the interpretation. Steward. The interpretation? And to think that in the hope of getting you to agree, I have judged the situation with more leniency than I actually feel. And I'm still withholding my verdict in order to spare you. But just one thing. In reality the prince does not need a strengthening of his foundations. If he uses all the power at present at his disposal, he'll find it sufficient to bring about everything that the most extreme responsibility before God and man may demand of him. But he shies away from the balance of life, he's on his way to becoming a tyrant. Chamberlain. He with his modest character. Steward. It's the modesty of the one half, for he needs all his energy for the second half which scrapes together the foundation needed to build something like the Tower of Babel. To hinder this work should be the sole policy of all those who are interested in their personal existence, in the principality, in the princess, and possibly even in the prince. Chamberlain. Possibly even, you're very candid. To be equally frank, your candor makes me tremble at the imminent decision. And I regret, as I've recently come to regret more and more, that I'm devoted to the prince almost to the point of helplessness. Steward. Everything is clear. You are not flirting with the opposition. In fact, you are even holding out a hand. Only one, which is commendable for an old courtier. And yet your only hope is that our great example carries you along. Chamberlain. Whatever I can do to prevent it, I shall do. Steward. It doesn't frighten me anymore. Pointing to the warden. And you who've been sitting there so quietly, have you understood everything that's been said? Chamberlain. The warden of the tomb? Steward. The warden of the tomb. One must probably be a stranger to size him up. Isn't that so, old boy, you little old screech owl, you? Have you ever seen him flying through the forest in the evening, out of any gun's reach? But by day he ducks at the slightest move. Chamberlain. I don't understand. Warden, almost in tears. You're scolding me, sir, and I don't know why. Please let me go home. I'm really not evil, I'm just the warden of the tomb. Chamberlain. You mistrust him. Steward. Mistrust? No, he's too insignificant for that. But I want to keep an eye on him. For I think, call it whim or superstition, if you like, that he's not just a mere tool of evil, but an upright, active worker for evil. Chamberlain. He has been serving the court quietly for 30 years, possibly without ever having been in the castle. Steward. Oh, moles like him build long passages before they emerge. Suddenly turns to warden. But first of all, away with this one. To servant. Take him to the Friedrichspark, stay with him, and don't let him out until further notice. Warden. Very frightened, I'm supposed to wait for His Highness, the Prince. Steward. An error. Off with you. Chamberlain. He must be treated with care. He's an old and sick man, and for some reason the prince sets store by him. Warden. Bowing low before Chamberlain. Steward. What? To servant. Treat him carefully, but for God's sake get him out of here. Quick. Servant, about to grab him. Chamberlain, stepping between them. No, we must get a carriage. Steward. It's the air at this court. I can't taste a grain of salt anywhere. All right then, a carriage. You take the treasure away in a carriage. But now, out of the room with you both. To Chamberlain. Your behavior shows me. Warden, collapses, with a little scream, on way to door. Steward, stamping his foot. Is it impossible to get rid of him? Pick him up in your arms if there's no other way. Can't you understand what's expected of you? Chamberlain. The prince. Servant, opening door at left. Steward. Ah. Glances at warden. I should have known that ghosts cannot be transported. Prince, enters with quick step, behind him the princess, dark young woman with teeth clenched, stops in doorway. Prince. What's happened? Steward. The warden felt ill, I was about to have him taken away. Prince. I should have been notified. Has the doctor been sent for? Chamberlain. I'll have him called. Hurries out by center door, returns at once. Prince, kneeling beside warden, prepare a bed for him. Fetch a stretcher. Is the doctor on his way? He's taking a long time. The pulse is very weak. I can't hear the heart. These miserable ribs, how worn out this body is. Stands up suddenly, fetches a glass of water, stares about him. One is so helpless. Kneels down again, moistens the warden's face. Now he's breathing better, it won't be so bad. Healthy stock, the kind that doesn't give up, even in extremity. But the doctor. While he glances toward the door, the warden raises his hand and caresses the prince's cheek. Princess turns her head away, toward the window. Enter servants with stretcher, prince helps to lift warden. Prince. Handle him gently. Oh, you with your great claws. Lift his head a little. Nearer the stretcher. The pillow further down his back. His arm. You're all bad nurses. I wonder if you'll ever be as tired as this man on the stretcher? There we are, and now with slow steps. And above all, steadily. Turning in door to princess. Here then is the warden of the tomb. Princess, nods. Prince. I had intended to show him to you differently. After taking another step, aren't you coming along? Princess. I'm so tired. Prince. The moment I've talked to the doctor I'll come back. And you, gentlemen, who wish to make your report, wait for me. Steward, to Princess. Does your highness require my services? Princess. Always. I am grateful for your vigilance. Do not abandon it, even if today it was in vain. Everything is at stake. You see more than I am always in my rooms. But I know it will get more and more gloomy. This autumn is sad beyond belief. Translated by Tanya and James Stern. A country doctor. I was in great perplexity. I had to start on an urgent journey. A seriously ill patient was waiting for me in a village 10 miles off. A thick blizzard of snow filled all the wide spaces between him and me. I had a light gig with big wheels, exactly right for our country roads. Muffled in furs, my bag of instruments in my hand, I was in the courtyard all ready for the journey. But there was no horse to be had, no horse. My own horse had died in the night, worn out by the fatigues of this icy winter. My servant girl was now running around the village trying to borrow a horse, but it was hopeless, I knew it, and I stood there forlornly, with the snow gathering more and more thickly upon me, more and more unable to move. In the gateway the girl appeared, alone, and waved the lantern. Of course, who would lend a horse at this time for such a journey? I strode through the courtyard once more. I could see no way out. In my confused distress I kicked at the dilapidated door of the year-long uninhabited pigsty. It flew open and flapped to and fro on its hinges. A steam and smell as of horses came out from it. A dim stable lantern was swinging inside from a rope. A man, crouching on his hams in that low space, showed an open blue-eyed face. "Shall I yoke up?" he asked, crawling out on all fours. I did not know what to say and merely stooped down to see what else was in the sty. The servant girl was standing beside me. "You never know what you're going to find in your own house," she said, and we both laughed. "Hey there, brother, hey there, sister," called the groom, and two horses, enormous creatures with powerful flanks, one after the other, their legs tucked close to their bodies, each well-shaped head lowered like a camel's, by sheer strength of buttocking squeezed out through the door hole which they filled entirely. But at once they were standing up, their legs long and their bodies steaming thickly. "Give him a hand," I said, and the willing girl hurried to help the groom with the harnessing. Yet hardly was she beside him when the groom clipped hold of her and pushed his face against hers. She screamed and fled back to me. On her cheek stood out in red the marks of 2 rows of teeth. "You brute," I yelled in fury, "do you want a whipping?" But in the same moment reflected that the man was a stranger. That I did not know where he came from, and that of his own free will he was helping me out when everyone else had failed me. As if he knew my thoughts he took no offense at my threat but, still busied with the horses, only turned around once toward me. "Get in," he said then, and indeed, everything was ready. A magnificent pair of horses, I observed, such as I had never sat behind, and I climbed in happily. "But I'll drive, you don't know the way," I said. "Of course," said he, "I'm not coming with you anyway, I'm staying with Rose." "No," shrieked Rose, fleeing into the house with a justified presentiment that her fate was inescapable. I heard the door chain rattle as she put it up. I heard the key turn in the lock. I could see, moreover, how she put out the lights in the entrance hall and in further flight all through the rooms to keep herself from being discovered. "You're coming with me," I said to the groom, "or I won't go, urgent as my journey is. I'm not thinking of paying for it by handing the girl over to you." "Gee up," he said, clapped his hands. The gig whirled off like a log in a freshet. I could just hear the door of my house splitting and bursting as the groom charged at it, and then I was deafened and blinded by a storming rush that steadily buffeted all my senses. But this only for a moment, since, as if my patient's farmyard had opened out just before my courtyard gate, I was already there. The horses had come quietly to a standstill. The blizzard had stopped. Moonlight all around. My patient's parents hurried out of the house, his sister behind them. I was almost lifted out of the gig. From their confused ejaculations I gathered not a word. In the sick room the air was almost unbreathable. The neglected stove was smoking. I wanted to push open a window, but first I had to look at my patient. Gaunt, without any fever, not cold, not warm, with vacant eyes, without a shirt, the youngster heaved himself up from under the feather bedding, threw his arms around my neck, and whispered in my ear, "Doctor, let me die." I glanced around the room. No one had heard it. The parents were leaning forward in silence waiting for my verdict. The sister had set a chair for my handbag. I opened the bag and hunted among my instruments. The boy kept clutching at me from his bed to remind me of his entreaty. I picked up a pair of tweezers, examined them in the candlelight, and laid them down again. Yes, I thought blasphemously, in cases like this the gods are helpful. Send the missing horse, add to it a second because of the urgency, and to crown everything bestow even a groom. And only now did I remember Rose again. What was I to do? How could I rescue her? How could I pull her away from under that groom at 10 miles distance, with a team of horses I couldn't control? These horses, now, they had somehow slipped the reins loose, pushed the windows open from outside. I did not know how. Each of them had stuck a head in at a window and, quite unmoved by the startled cries of the family, stood eyeing the patient. Better go back at once, I thought, as if the horses were summoning me to the return journey, yet I permitted the patient's sister, who fancied that I was dazed by the heat, to take my fur coat from me. A glass of rum was poured out for me. The old man clapped me on the shoulder, a familiarity justified by this offer of his treasure. I shook my head. In the narrow confines of the old man's thoughts I felt ill. That was my only reason for refusing the drink. The mother stood by the bedside and cajoled me toward it. I yielded, and, while one of the horses whinnied loudly to the ceiling, laid my head to the boy's breast, which shivered under my wet beard. I confirmed what I already knew. The boy was quite sound, something a little wrong with his circulation, saturated with coffee by his solicitous mother, but sound and best turned out of bed with one shove. I am no world reformer, and so I let him lie. I was the district doctor and did my duty to the uttermost, to the point where it became almost too much. I was badly paid and yet generous and helpful to the poor. I had still to see that Rose was all right, and then the boy might have his way and I wanted to die too. What was I doing there in that endless winter? My horse was dead, and not a single person in the village would lend me another. I had to get my team out of the pigsty. If they hadn't chanced to be horses, I should have had to travel with swine. That was how it was. And I nodded to the family. They knew nothing about it, and, had they known, would not have believed it. To write prescriptions is easy, but to come to an understanding with people is hard. Well, this should be the end of my visit. I had once more been called out needlessly. I was used to that. The whole district made my life a torment with my night bell, but that I should have to sacrifice Rose this time as well, the pretty girl who had lived in my house for years almost without my noticing her. That sacrifice was too much to ask, and I had somehow to get it reasoned out in my head with the help of what craft I could muster, in order not to let fly at this family, which with the best will in the world could not restore Rose to me. But as I shut my bag and put an arm out for my fur coat, the family meanwhile standing together, the father sniffing at the glass of rum in his hand, the mother, apparently disappointed in me. Why, what do people expect? Biting her lips with tears in her eyes, the sister fluttering a blood-soaked towel, I was somehow ready to admit conditionally that the boy might be ill after all. I went toward him. He welcomed me smiling as if I were bringing him the most nourishing and valid broth. Ah, now both horses were whinnying together. The noise, I suppose, was ordained by heaven to assist my examination of the patient, and this time I discovered that the boy was indeed ill. In his right side, near the hip, was an open wound as big as the palm of my hand. Rose red, in many variations of shade, dark in the hollows, lighter at the edges, softly granulated, with irregular clots of blood, open as a surface mine to the daylight. That was how it looked from a distance. But on a closer inspection there was another complication. I could not help a low whistle of surprise. Worms, as thick and as long as my little finger, themselves rose red and blood-spotted as well, were wriggling from their fastness in the interior of the wound toward the light, with small white heads and many little legs. Poor boy, you were past helping. I had discovered your great wound. This blossom in your side was destroying you. The family was pleased. They saw me busying myself. The sister told the mother the father told several guests who were coming in, through the moonlight at the open door, walking on tiptoe, keeping their balance with outstretched arms. Will you save me? Whispered the boy with a sob, quite blinded by the life within his wound. That is what people are like in my district. Always expecting the impossible from the doctor. They have lost their ancient beliefs. The parson sits at home and unravels his vestments, one after another. But the doctor is supposed to be omnipotent with his merciful surgeon's hand. Well, as it pleases them, I have not thrust my services on them. If they misuse me for sacred ends, I let that happen to me too. What better do I want, old country doctor that I am, bereft of my servant girl? And so they came, the family and the village elders, and stripped my clothes off me. A school choir with the teacher at the head of it stood before the house and sang these words to an utterly simple tune. Strip his clothes off, then he'll heal us. If he doesn't, kill him dead. Only a doctor, only a doctor. Then my clothes were off and I looked at the people quietly, my fingers in my beard and my head cocked to one side. I was altogether composed and equal to the situation and remained so, although it was no help to me, since they now took me by the head and feet and carried me to the bed. They laid me down in it next to the wall, on the side of the wound. Then they all left the room. The door was shut. The singing stopped. Clouds covered the moon. The bedding was warm around me. The horses' heads in the open windows wavered like shadows. Do you know, said a voice in my ear, I have very little confidence in you. Why, you were only blown in here, you didn't come on your own feet. Instead of helping me, you're cramping me on my deathbed. What I'd like best is to scratch your eyes out. Right, I said, it is a shame. And yet I am a doctor. What am I to do? Believe me, it is not too easy for me either. Am I supposed to be content with this apology? Oh, I must be, I can't help it. I always have to put up with things. A fine wound is all I brought into the world, that was my sole endowment. My young friend, said I, your mistake is, you have not a wide enough view. I have been in all the sick rooms, far and wide, and I tell you, your wound is not so bad. Done in a tight corner with 2 strokes of the axe. Many a one proffers his side and can hardly hear the axe in the forest, far less that it is coming nearer to him. Is that really so, or are you deluding me in my fever? It is really so, take the word of honor of an official doctor. And he took it and lay still. But now it was time for me to think of escaping. The horses were still standing faithfully in their places. My clothes, my fur coat, my bag were quickly collected. I didn't want to waste time dressing. If the horses raced home as they had come, I should only be springing, as it were, out of this bed into my own. Obediently a horse backed away from the window. I threw my bundle into the gig. The fur coat missed its mark and was caught on a hook only by the sleeve. Good enough. I swung myself onto the horse. With the reins loosely trailing, one horse barely fastened to the other, the gig swaying behind, my fur coat last of all in the snow. Gee up, I said, but there was no galloping. Slowly, like old men, we crawled through the snowy wastes. A long time echoed behind us the new but faulty song of the children. Oh, be joyful, all you patients. The doctor's laid in bed beside you. Never shall I reach home at this rate. My flourishing practice is done for. My successor is robbing me, but in vain, for he cannot take my place. In my house the disgusting groom is raging. Rose is his victim. I do not want to think about it any more. Naked, exposed to the frost of this most unhappy of ages, with an earthly vehicle, unearthly horses, old man that I am, I wander astray. My fur coat is hanging from the back of the gig, but I cannot reach it, and none of my limber pack of patience lifts a finger. Betrayed, betrayed. A false alarm on the night bell once answered. It cannot be made good, not ever. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The Hunter Grachus. 2 boys were sitting on the harbor wall playing with dice. A man was reading a newspaper on the steps of the monument, resting in the shadow of a hero who was flourishing his sword on high. A girl was filling her bucket at the fountain. A fruit seller was lying beside his wares, gazing at the lake. Through the vacant window and door openings of a cafe one could see 2 men quite at the back drinking their wine. The proprietor was sitting at a table in front and dozing. A bark was silently making for the little harbor, as if borne by invisible means over the water. A man in a blue blouse climbed ashore and drew the rope through a ring. Behind the boatman 2 other men in dark coats with silver buttons carried a bier, on which, beneath a great flower-patterned fringed silk cloth, a man was apparently lying. Nobody on the quay troubled about the newcomers. Even when they lowered the bier to wait for the boatman, who was still occupied with his rope, nobody went nearer, nobody asked them a question, nobody accorded them an inquisitive glance. The pilot was still further detained by a woman who, a child at her breast, now appeared with loosened hair on the deck of the boat. Then he advanced and indicated a yellowish 2-storied house that rose abruptly on the left near the water. The bearers took up their burden and bore it to the low but gracefully pillared door. A little boy opened a window just in time to see the party vanishing into the house, then hastily shut the window again. The door too was now shut. It was of black oak and very strongly made. A flock of doves which had been flying around the belfry alighted in the street before the house. As if their food were stored within, they assembled in front of the door. One of them flew up to the first story and pecked at the windowpane. They were bright-hued, well-tended, lively birds. The woman on the boat flung grain to them in a wide sweep. They ate it up and flew across to the woman. A man in a top hat tied with a band of black crape now descended one of the narrow and very steep lanes that led to the harbor. He glanced around vigilantly. Everything seemed to distress him, his mouth twisted at the sight of some offal in a corner. Fruit skins were lying on the steps of the monument. He swept them off in passing with his stick. He rapped at the house door, at the same time taking his top hat from his head with his black-gloved hand. The door was opened at once, and some 50 little boys appeared in 2 rows in the long entry hall and bowed to him. The boatman descended the stairs, greeted the gentleman in black, conducted him up to the first story, led him around the bright and elegant loggia which encircled the courtyard, and both of them entered, while the boys pressed after them at a respectful distance, a cool spacious room looking toward the back, from whose window no habitation, but only a bare, blackish-gray rocky wall was to be seen. The bearers were busied in setting up and lighting several long candles at the head of the bier, yet these did not give light, but only disturbed the shadows which had been immobile till then, and made them flicker over the walls. The cloth covering the bier had been thrown back. Lying on it was a man with wildly matted hair, who looked somewhat like a hunter. He lay without motion and, it seemed, without breathing, his eyes closed, yet only his trappings indicated that this man was probably dead. The gentleman stepped up to the bier, laid his hand on the brow of the man lying upon it, then kneeled down and prayed. The boatman made a sign to the bearers to leave the room. They went out, drove away the boys who had gathered outside, and shut the door. But even that did not seem to satisfy the gentleman. He glanced at the boatman. The boatman understood, and vanished through a side door into the next room. At once the man on the bier opened his eyes, turned his face painfully toward the gentleman, and said, "Who are you?" Without any mark of surprise the gentleman rose from his kneeling posture and answered, "The burgomaster of Riva." The man on the bier nodded, indicated a chair with a feeble movement of his arm, and said, after the burgomaster had accepted his invitation, "I knew that, of course, burgomaster, but in the first moments of returning consciousness I always forget. Everything goes around before my eyes, and it is best to ask about anything even if I know. You too probably know that I am the Hunter Grachus." "Certainly," said the burgomaster. "Your arrival was announced to me during the night. We had been asleep for a good while. Then toward midnight my wife cried, 'Salvatore, that's my name, look at that dove at the window.' It was really a dove, but as big as a cock. It flew over me and said in my ear, 'Tomorrow the dead Hunter Grachus is coming. Receive him in the name of the city.' The hunter nodded and licked his lips with the tip of his tongue. 'Yes, the doves flew here before me. But do you believe, burgomaster, that I shall remain in Riva?' 'I cannot say that yet,' replied the burgomaster. 'Are you dead?' 'Yes,' said the hunter, 'as you see. Many years ago, yes, it must be a great many years ago, I fell from a precipice in the Black Forest. That is in Germany, when I was hunting a chamois. Since then I have been dead. But you are alive too,' said the burgomaster. 'In a certain sense,' said the hunter, 'in a certain sense I am alive too. My death ship lost its way. A wrong turn of the wheel, a moment's absence of mind on the pilot's part, the distraction of my lovely native country. I cannot tell what it was. I only know this, that I remained on Earth and that ever since my ship has sailed earthly waters. So I, who asked for nothing better than to live among my mountains, travel after my death through all the lands of the earth. And you have no part in the other world? Asked the burgomaster, knitting his brow. I am forever, replied the hunter, on the great stair that leads up to it. On that infinitely wide and spacious stair I clamber about, sometimes up, sometimes down, sometimes on the right, sometimes on the left, always in motion. The hunter has been turned into a butterfly. Do not laugh. I am not laughing, said the burgomaster in self-defense. That is very good of you, said the hunter. I am always in motion. But when I make a supreme flight and see the gate actually shining before me, I awaken presently on my old ship, still stranded forlornly in some earthly sea or other. The fundamental error of my one-time death grins at me as I lie in my cabin. Julia, the wife of the pilot, knocks at the door and brings me on my bier the morning drink of the land whose coasts we chance to be passing. I lie on a wooden pallet, I wear, it cannot be a pleasure to look at me, a filthy winding sheet, my hair and beard, black tinged with gray, have grown together inextricably, my limbs are covered with a great flowered patterned woman's shawl with long fringes. A sacramental candle stands at my head and lights me. On the wall opposite me is a little picture, evidently of a bushman who is aiming his spear at me and taking cover as best he can behind a beautifully painted shield. On shipboard one often comes across silly pictures, but that is the silliest of them all. Otherwise my wooden cage is quite empty. Through a hole in the side the warm airs of the southern night come in, and I hear the water slapping against the old boat. I have lain here ever since the time when, as the hunter Gratius living in the Black Forest, I followed a chamois and fell from a precipice. Everything happened in good order. I pursued, I fell, bled to death in a ravine, died, and this ship should have conveyed me to the next world. I can still remember how gladly I stretched myself out on this pallet for the first time. Never did the mountains listen to such songs from me as these shadowy walls did then. I had been glad to live and I was glad to die. Before I stepped aboard, I joyfully flung away my wretched load of ammunition, my knapsack, my hunting rifle that I had always been proud to carry, and I slipped into my winding sheet like a girl into her marriage dress. I lay and waited. Then came the mishap. A terrible fate, said the burgomaster, raising his hand defensively. And you bear no blame for it? None, said the hunter. I was a hunter. Was there any sin in that? I followed my calling as a hunter in the Black Forest, where there were still wolves in those days. I lay in ambush, shot, hit my mark, flayed the skins from my victims. Was there any sin in that? My labors were blessed. The great hunter of the Black Forest was the name I was given. Was there any sin in that? I am not called upon to decide that, said the burgomaster, but to me also there seems to be no sin in such things. But then, whose is the guilt? The boatman's, said the hunter. Nobody will read what I say here, no one will come to help me. Even if all the people were commanded to help me, every door and window would remain shut, everybody would take to bed and draw the bedclothes over his head, the whole earth would become an inn for the night. And there is sense in that, for nobody knows of me, and if anyone knew he would not know where I could be found, and if he knew where I could be found, he would not know how to deal with me, he would not know how to help me. The thought of helping me is an illness that has to be cured by taking to one's bed. I know that, and so I do not shout to summon help, even though at moments, when I lose control over myself, as I have done just now, for instance, I think seriously of it. But to drive out such thoughts I need only look around me and verify where I am, and, I can safely assert, have been for hundreds of years. Extraordinary, said the burgomaster, extraordinary. And now do you think of staying here in Riva with us? I think not, said the hunter with a smile, and, to excuse himself, he laid his hand on the burgomaster's knee. I am here, more than that I do not know, further than that I cannot go. My ship has no rudder, and it is driven by the wind that blows in the undermost regions of death. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The hunter Gratius, a fragment. Is it true, hunter Gratius, that you have been cruising about in this old boat for hundreds of years? For 1500 years. And always in this ship? Always in this bark. Bark, I believe, is the correct expression. You aren't familiar with nautical matters? No, I never gave them a thought until today, until I heard about you, until I boarded your ship. Don't apologize. I'm from the interior, too. Never been a seafarer, never wanted to be one, mountains and forests were my friends, and now, most ancient of seafarers, hunter Gratius, patron saint of sailors, hunter Gratius. The cabin boy shivering with fear in the crow's nest in the stormy night prays to me with wringing hands. Don't laugh. Me laugh? Certainly not. With a beating heart I stood before your cabin door, with a beating heart I entered. Your friendly manner has calmed me a little, but I'll never forget whose guest I am. You're right, of course. However it may be, I am hunter Gratius. Won't you drink some wine? I don't know the brand, but it's sweet and heavy, the master does me proud. Not just now, I'm too restless. Later perhaps, if you can bear with me that long. Besides, I wouldn't dare drink out of your glass. Who is the master? The owner of the bark. They are excellent men, these masters. Except that I don't understand them. I don't mean their language, although of course I often don't understand their language, either. But this is beside the point. Over the centuries I've learned enough languages to act as interpreter between this generation and their ancestors. What I don't understand is the way the masters' minds work. Perhaps you can explain it to me. I haven't much hope. How could I explain anything to you, compared with whom I am but a babbling babe? Don't talk like that. You'd do me a favor if you'd be a little more manly, more self-assured. What am I to do with a mere shadow of a guest? I'll blow him through the porthole into the lake. I need several explanations. You who roam around outside can give me them. But if you sit trembling at my table here and by self-deception forget the little you know, then you may as well clear out at once. What I mean, I say. There's something in that. In fact, I am superior to you in some ways. So I'll try to control myself. Ask away. Better, far better that you exaggerate in this direction and that you fancy yourself to be somehow superior. But you must understand me properly. I am a human being like you. I'm as many centuries more impatient as I am older than you. Well, let's talk about the masters. Listen, and drink some wine, to sharpen your wits. Don't be shy, take a good swig. There's another large shipload there. Gracious, that's an excellent wine. Long live the master. Pity that he died today. He was a good man and he went peacefully. Healthy, grown-up children stood at his deathbed, his wife had fainted at the foot, but his last thought was for me. A good man, a hamburger. Heavens above, a hamburger. And you down here in the south know that he died today? What, I not know when my master dies? You're really a bit simple-minded. Are you trying to insult me? Not at all, I do it without meaning to. But you shouldn't be so surprised. Drink more wine. As for the masters, it's like this. Originally, the bark belonged to no one. Gracious, one request. First, tell me briefly but coherently how things are with you. To be truthful, I really don't know. You of course take these things for granted and assume, as is your way, that the whole world knows about them. But in this brief human life, and life really is brief, gracious, try to grasp that, in this brief life it's as much as one can do to get oneself and one's family through. Interesting as the hunter Gracious is, this is conviction, not flattery. There's no time to think of him, to find out about him, let alone worry about him. Perhaps on one's deathbed, like your hamburger, this I don't know. Perhaps the busy man will then have a chance to stretch out for the first time and let the green hunter Gracious pass for once through his idle thoughts. But otherwise, it's as I've said. I knew nothing about you. Business brought me down here to the harbor. I saw the bark, the gangplank lay ready. I walked across. But now I'd like to know something coherent about you. Ah, coherent. That old story. All the books are full of it. Teachers draw it on the blackboard in every school. The mother dreams of it while suckling her child. Lovers murmur it while embracing. Merchants tell it to the customers to the merchants. Soldiers sing it on the march. Preachers declaim it in church. Historians in their studies realize with open mouths what happened long ago and never cease describing it. It is printed in the newspapers and people pass it from hand to hand. The telegraph was invented so that it might encircle the world the faster. It is excavated from ruined cities, and the elevator rushes it up to the top of the skyscraper. Railway passengers announce it from the windows to the countries they are passing through, but even before that the savages have hurled it at them. It can be read in the stars and the lakes reflect it. The streams bring it down from the mountains and the snow scatters it again on the summit. And you, man, sit here and ask me for coherence. You must have had an exceptionally dissipated youth. Possibly, as is typical of any youth. But it would be very useful, I think, if you would go and have a good look around the world. Strange as it may seem to you, and sitting here it surprises even me, it's a fact that you are not the talk of the town. However many subjects may be discussed, you are not among them. The world goes its way and you go on your journey, but until today I have never noticed that your paths have crossed. These are your observations, my dear friend. Other people have made others. There are only two possibilities here. Either you conceal what you know about me, and do so with a definite motive. In which case, let me tell you frankly, you are on the wrong track. Or you actually think that you can't remember me, because you confuse my story with someone else's. In that case I can only tell you, I am. No, I can't, everyone knows it and of all people I should be the one to tell you. It's so long ago. Ask the historians. Go to them, and then come back. It's so long ago. How can I be expected to keep it in this overcrowded brain? Wait, Gracious, I'll make it easier for you, I'll ask you some questions. Where do you come from? From the Black Forest, as everyone knows. From the Black Forest, of course. And was it there, around about the 4th century, that you used to hunt? Man alive, do you know the Black Forest? No, you really don't know anything. The helmsman's little child knows more than you, probably far more. Who on earth sent you in here? It's fate. Your obtrusive modesty was indeed only too well justified. You are a nonentity whom I'm filling up with wine. Now you don't even know the Black Forest. And I was born there. I hunted there until I was 25. If only the chamois had not led me astray. Well, now you know it. I'd have had a long pleasant hunter's life, but the chamois led me on. I fell down a precipice and was killed on the rocks. Don't ask any more. Here I am, dead, dead, dead. Don't know why I'm here. Was loaded onto the death ship, as befits a miserable dead man, the 3 or 4 ministrations were performed upon me, as on everyone. Why should they make an exception of the 100 Gratius? Everything was in order. I lay stretched out in the boat. Translated by Tanya and James Stern. The Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of China was finished off at its northernmost corner. From the southeast and the southwest it came up in 2 sections that finally converged there. This principle of piecemeal construction was also applied on a smaller scale by both of the 2 great armies of labor, the Eastern and the Western. It was done in this way. Gangs of some 20 workers were formed who had to accomplish a length, say, of 500 yards of wall, while a similar gang built another stretch of the same length to meet the first. But after the junction had been made, the construction of the wall was not carried on from the point, let us say, where this 1,000 yards ended. Instead, the 2 groups of workers were transferred to begin building again in quite different neighborhoods. Naturally, in this way many great gaps were left, which were only filled in gradually and bit by bit, some, indeed, not till after the official announcement that the wall was finished. In fact, it is said that there are gaps which have never been filled in at all, an assertion, however, that is probably merely one of the many legends to which the building of the wall gave rise, and which cannot be verified, at least by any single man with his own eyes and judgment, on account of the extent of the structure. Now on first thoughts one might conceive that it would have been more advantageous in every way to build the wall continuously, or at least continuously within the 2 main divisions. After all, the wall was intended, as was universally proclaimed and known, to be a protection against the peoples of the north. But how can a wall protect if it is not a continuous structure? Not only can such a wall not protect, but what there is of it is in perpetual danger. These blocks of wall left standing in deserted regions could be easily pulled down again and again by the nomads, especially as these tribes, rendered apprehensive by the building operations, kept changing their encampments with incredible rapidity, like locusts, and so perhaps had a better general view of the progress of the wall than we, the builders. Nevertheless, the task of construction probably could not have been carried out in any other way. To understand this we must take into account the following. The wall was to be a protection for centuries. Accordingly, the most scrupulous care in the building, the application of the architectural wisdom of all known ages and peoples, an unremitting sense of personal responsibility in the builders were indispensable prerequisites for the work. True, for the more purely manual tasks ignorant day laborers from the populace, men, women, and children who offered their services for good money, could be employed. But for the supervision even of every 4-day laborers an expert versed in the art of building was required, a man who was capable of entering into and feeling with all his heart what was involved. And the higher the task, the greater the responsibility. And such men were actually to be had, if not indeed so abundantly as the work of construction could have absorbed, yet in great numbers. For the work had not been undertaken without thought. 50 years before the first stone was laid, the art of architecture, and especially that of masonry, had been proclaimed as the most important branch of knowledge throughout the whole area of a China that was to be walled around, and all other arts gained recognition only in so far as they had reference to it. I can still remember quite well us standing as small children, scarcely sure on our feet, in our teacher's garden, and being ordered to build a sort of wall out of pebbles, and then the teacher, girding up his robe, ran full tilt against the wall, of course knocking it down, and scolded us so terribly for the shoddiness of our work that we ran weeping in all directions to our parents. A trivial incident, but significant of the spirit of the time. I was lucky inasmuch as the building of the wall was just beginning when, at 20, I had passed the last examination of the lowest school. I say lucky, for many who before my time had achieved the highest degree of culture available to them could find nothing year after year to do with their knowledge, and drifted uselessly about with the most splendid architectural plans in their heads, and sank by thousands into hopelessness. But those who finally came to be employed in the work as supervisors, even though it might be of the lowest rank, were truly worthy of their task. They were masons who had reflected much, and did not cease to reflect, on the building of the wall, men who with the first stone they sank in the ground felt themselves a part of the wall. Masons of that kind, of course, had not only a desire to perform their work in the most thorough manner, but were also impatient to see the wall finished in its complete perfection. Day laborers have not this impatience, for they look only to their wages, and the higher supervisors, indeed even the supervisors of middle rank, could see enough of the manifold growth of the construction to keep their spirits confident and high. But to encourage the subordinate supervisors, intellectually so vastly superior to their apparently petty tasks, other measures must be taken. One could not, for instance, expect them to lay one stone on another for months or even years on end, in an uninhabited mountainous region, hundreds of miles from their homes. The hopelessness of such hard toil, which yet could not reach completion even in the longest lifetime, would have cast them into despair and above all made them less capable for the work. It was for this reason that the system of piecemeal building was decided on. 500 yards could be accomplished in about 5 years. By that time, however, the supervisors were as a rule quite exhausted and had lost all faith in themselves, in the wall, in the world. Accordingly, while they were still exalted by the jubilant celebrations marking the completion of the 1,000 yards of wall, they were sent far, far away, saw on their journey finished sections of the wall rising here and there, came past the quarters of the high command and were presented with badges of honor, heard the rejoicings of new armies of labor streaming past from the depths of the land, saw forests being cut down to become supports for the wall, saw mountains being hewn into stones for the wall, heard at the holy shrines hymns rising in which the pious prayed for the completion of the wall. All this assuaged their impatience. The quiet life of their homes, where they rested some time, strengthened them. The humble credulity with which their reports were listened to, the confidence with which the simple and peaceful burgher believed in the eventual completion of the wall, all this filled their hearts with a new buoyancy. Like eternally hopeful children, they then said farewell to their homes. The desire once more to labor on the wall of the nation became irresistible. They set off earlier than they needed. Half the village accompanied them for long distances. Groups of people with banners and streamers waving were on all the roads. Never before had they seen how great and rich and beautiful and worthy of love their country was. Every fellow countryman was a brother for whom one was building a wall of protection, and who would return lifelong thanks for it with all he had and did. Unity, unity, shoulder to shoulder, a ring of brothers, a current of blood no longer confined within the narrow circulation of one body, but sweetly rolling and yet ever returning throughout the endless leagues of China. Thus, then, the system of piecemeal construction becomes comprehensible, but there were still other reasons for it as well. Nor is there anything odd in my pausing over this question for so long. It is one of the crucial problems in the whole building of the wall, unimportant as it may appear at first glance. If I am to convey and make understandable the ideas and feelings of that time, I cannot go deeply enough into this very question. First, then, it must be said that in those days things were achieved scarcely inferior to the construction of the Tower of Babel, although as regards divine approval, at least according to human reckoning, strongly at variance with that work. I say this because during the early days of building a scholar wrote a book in which he drew the comparison in the most exhaustive way. In it he tried to prove that the Tower of Babel failed to reach its goal, not because of the reasons universally advanced, or at least that among those recognized reasons the most important of all was not to be found. His proofs were drawn not merely from written documents and reports. He also claimed to have made inquiries on the spot, and to have discovered that the tower failed and was bound to fail because of the weakness of the foundation. In this respect, at any rate, our age was vastly superior to that ancient one. Almost every educated man of our time was a mason by profession and infallible in the matter of laying foundations. That, however, was not what our scholar was concerned to prove, for he maintained that the Great Wall alone would provide for the first time in the history of mankind a secure foundation for a new Tower of Babel. First the wall, therefore, and then the tower. His book was in everybody's hands at that time, but I admit that even today I cannot quite make out how he conceived this tower. How could the wall, which did not form even a circle, but only a sort of quarter or half circle, provide the foundation for a tower? That could obviously be meant only in a spiritual sense. But in that case, why build the actual wall, which after all was something concrete, the result of the lifelong labor of multitudes of people? And why were there in the book plans, somewhat nebulous plans, it must be admitted, of the tower, and proposals worked out in detail for mobilizing the people's energies for the stupendous new work? There were many wild ideas in people's heads at that time. This scholar's book is only one example, perhaps simply because so many were trying to join forces as far as they could for the achievement of a single aim. Human nature, essentially changeable, unstable as the dust, can endure no restraint. If it binds itself, it soon begins to tear madly at its bonds, until it rends everything asunder, the wall, the bonds, and its very self. It is possible that these very considerations, which militated against the building of the wall at all, were not left out of account by the High Command when the system of piecemeal construction was decided on. We, and here I speak in the name of many people, did not really know ourselves until we had carefully scrutinized the decrees of the High Command, when we discovered that without the High Command neither our book learning nor our human understanding would have sufficed for the humble tasks which we performed in the great whole. In the office of the command, where it was and who sat there no one whom I have asked knew then or knows now. In that office one may be certain that all human thoughts and desires revolved in a circle, and all human aims and fulfillments in a countercircle. And through the window the reflected splendors of divine worlds fell on the hands of the leaders as they traced their plans. And for that reason the incorruptible observer must hold that the command, if it had seriously desired it, could also have overcome those difficulties that prevented a system of continuous construction. There remains, therefore, nothing but the conclusion that the command deliberately chose the system of piecemeal construction. But the piecemeal construction was only a makeshift and therefore inexpedient. Remains the conclusion that the command willed something inexpedient. Strange conclusion. True, and yet in one respect it has much to be said for it. One can perhaps safely discuss it now. In those days many people, and among them the best, had a secret maxim which ran: try with all your might to comprehend the decrees of the High Command, but only up to a certain point, then avoid further meditation. A very wise maxim, which moreover was elaborated in a parable that was later often quoted: avoid further meditation, but not because it might be harmful. It is not at all certain that it would be harmful. What is harmful or not harmful has nothing to do with the question. Consider rather the river in spring. It rises until it grows mightier and nourishes more richly the soil on the long stretch of its banks, still maintaining its own course until it reaches the sea, where it is all the more welcome because it is a worthier ally. Thus far may you urge your meditations on the decrees of the High Command. But after that the river overflows its banks, loses outline and shape, slows down the speed of its current, tries to ignore its destiny by forming little seas in the interior of the land, damages the fields, and yet cannot maintain itself for long in its new expanse, but must run back between its banks again, must even dry up wretchedly in the hot season that presently follows. Thus far may you not urge your meditations on the decrees of the high command. Now though this parable may have had extraordinary point and force during the building of the wall, it has at most only a restricted relevance for my present essay. My inquiry is purely historical. No lightning flashes any longer from the long since vanished thunderclouds, and so I may venture to seek for an explanation of the system of piecemeal construction which goes farther than the one that contented people then. The limits that my capacity for thought imposes upon me are narrow enough, but the province to be traversed here is infinite. Against whom was the Great Wall to serve as a protection? Against the people of the north. Now, I come from the southeast of China. No northern people can menace us there. We read of them in the books of the ancients. The cruelties they commit in accordance with their nature make us sigh in our peaceful arbors. The faithful representations of the artist show us these faces of the damned, their gaping mouths, their jaws furnished with great pointed teeth, their half-shut eyes that already seem to be seeking out the victim which their jaws will rend and devour. When our children are unruly we show them these pictures, and at once they fly weeping into our arms. But nothing more than that do we know about these northerners. We have not seen them, and if we remain in our villages we shall never see them, even if on their wild horses they should ride as hard as they can straight toward us. The land is too vast and would not let them reach us, they would end their course in the empty air. Why, then, since that is so, did we leave our homes, the stream with its bridges, our mothers and fathers, our weeping wives, our children who needed our care, and depart for the distant city to be trained there, while our thoughts journeyed still farther away to the wall in the north? Why? A question for the high command. Our leaders know us. They, absorbed in gigantic anxieties, know of us, know our petty pursuits, see us sitting together in our humble huts, and approve or disapprove the evening prayer which the father of the house recites in the midst of his family. And if I may be allowed to express such ideas about the high command, then I must say that in my opinion the high command has existed from old time, and was not assembled, say, like a gathering of mandarins summoned hastily to discuss somebody's fine dream in a conference as hastily terminated, so that very evening the people are drummed out of their beds to carry out what has been decided, even if it should be nothing but an illumination in honor of a god who may have shown great favor to their masters the day before, only to drive them into some dark corner with cudgel blows tomorrow, almost before the illuminations have died down. Far rather do I believe that the high command has existed from all eternity, and the decision to build the wall likewise. Unwitting peoples of the north, who imagined they were the cause of it. Honest, unwitting emperor, who imagined he decreed it. We builders of the wall know that it was not so and hold our tongues. During the building of the wall and ever since to this very day I have occupied myself almost exclusively with the comparative history of races. There are certain questions that one can probe to the marrow, as it were, only by this method, and I have discovered that we Chinese possess certain folk and political institutions that are unique in their clarity, others again unique in their obscurity. The desire to trace the cause of these phenomena, especially the latter, has always intrigued me and intrigues me still, and the building of the wall is itself essentially involved with these problems. Now one of the most obscure of our institutions is that of the empire itself. In Peking, naturally, at the imperial court, there is some clarity to be found on this subject, though even that is more elusive than real. Also the teachers of political law and history in the schools of higher learning claim to be exactly informed on these matters, and to be capable of passing on their knowledge to their students. The farther one descends among the lower schools the more, naturally enough, does one find teachers and pupils' doubts of their own knowledge vanishing, and superficial culture mounting sky high around a few precepts that have been drilled into people's minds for centuries, precepts which, though they have lost nothing of their eternal truth, remain eternally invisible in this fog of confusion. But it is precisely this question of the empire which in my opinion the common people should be asked to answer, since after all they are the empire's final support. Here, I must confess, I can only speak once more for my native place. Except for the nature gods and their ritual which fills the whole year in such beautiful and rich alternation, we think only about the emperor. But not about the present one, or rather we would think about the present one if we knew who he was or knew anything definite about him. True, and it is the sole curiosity that fills us. We are always trying to get information on this subject, but, strange as it may sound, it is almost impossible to discover anything, either from pilgrims, though they have wandered through much of our land, or from near or distant villages, or from sailors, though they have navigated not only our little stream, but also the sacred rivers. One hears a great many things, true, but can gather nothing definite. So vast is our land that no fable could do justice to its vastness, the heavens can scarcely span it, and Peking is only a dot in it, and the imperial palace less than a dot. The emperor as such, on the other hand, is mighty throughout all the hierarchies of the world, admitted. But the existent emperor, a man like us, lies much like us on a couch which is of generous proportions, perhaps, and yet very possibly may be quite narrow and short. Like us he sometimes stretches himself and when he is very tired yawns with his delicately cut mouth. But how should we know anything about that, thousands of miles away in the south, almost on the borders of the Tibetan highlands? And besides, any tidings, even if they did reach us, would arrive far too late, would have become obsolete long before they reached us. The emperor is always surrounded by a brilliant and yet ambiguous throng of nobles and courtiers, malice and enmity in the guise of servants and friends. who form a counterweight to the imperial power and perpetually labor to unseat the ruler from his place with poisoned arrows. The empire is immortal, but the emperor himself totters and falls from his throne. Yes, whole dynasties sink in the end and breathe their last in one death rattle. Of these struggles and sufferings the people will never know. Like tardy arrivals, like strangers in a city, they stand at the end of some densely thronged side street peacefully munching the food they have brought with them, while far away in front, in the market square at the heart of the city, the execution of their ruler is proceeding. There is a parable that describes this situation very well. The emperor, so it runs, has sent a message to you, the humble subject, the insignificant shadow cowering in the remotest distance before the imperial sun. The emperor from his deathbed has sent a message to you alone. He has commanded the messenger to kneel down by the bed, and has whispered the message to him. So much store did he lay on it that he ordered the messenger to whisper it back into his ear again. Then by a nod of the head he has confirmed that it is right. Yes, before the assembled spectators of his death, all the obstructing walls have been broken down, and on the spacious and loftily mounting open staircases stand in a ring the great princes of the empire. Before all these he has delivered his message. The messenger immediately sets out on his journey, a powerful and indefatigable man, now pushing with his right arm, now with his left, he cleaves a way for himself through the throng. If he encounters resistance he points to his breast, where the symbol of the sun glitters. The way is made easier for him than it would be for any other man. But the multitudes are so vast, their numbers have no end. If he could reach the open fields how fast he would fly, and soon doubtless you would hear the welcome hammering of his fists on your door. But instead how vainly does he wear out his strength, still he is only making his way through the chambers of the innermost palace. Never will he get to the end of them, and if he succeeded in that nothing would be gained. He must next fight his way down the stair, and if he succeeded in that nothing would be gained. The courts would still have to be crossed, and after the courts the second outer palace, and once more stairs and courts, and once more another palace, and so on for thousands of years, and if at last he should burst through the outermost gate, but never, never can that happen, the imperial capital would lie before him, the center of the world, crammed to bursting with its own sediment. Nobody could fight his way through here even with a message from a dead man. But you sit at your window when evening falls and dream it to yourself. Just so, as hopelessly and as hopefully, do our people regard the emperor. They do not know what emperor is reigning, and there exist doubts regarding even the name of the dynasty. In school a great deal is taught about the dynasties with the dates of succession, but the universal uncertainty in this matter is so great that even the best scholars are drawn into it. Long dead emperors are set on the throne in our villages, and one that only lives on in song recently had a proclamation of his read out by the priest before the altar. Battles that are old history are new to us, and one's neighbor rushes in with a jubilant face to tell the news. The wives of the emperors, pampered and overweening, seduced from noble custom by wily courtiers, swelling with ambition, vehement in their greed, uncontrollable in their lust, practice their abominations ever anew. The more deeply they are buried in time, the more glaring are the colors in which their deeds are painted, and with a loud cry of woe our village eventually hears how an empress drank her husband's blood in long draughts thousands of years ago. Thus, then, do our people deal with departed emperors, but the living ruler they confuse among the dead. If once, only once in a man's lifetime, an imperial official on his tour of the provinces should arrive by chance at our village, make certain announcements in the name of the government, scrutinize the tax lists, examine the school children, inquire of the priest regarding our doings and affairs, and then, before he steps into his sedan chair, should sum up his impressions in verbose admonitions to the assembled commune. Then a smile flits over every face, people throw surreptitious glances at each other, and bend over their children so as not to be observed by the official. Why, they think to themselves, he's speaking of a dead man as if he were alive. This emperor of his died long ago, the dynasty is blotted out, the good official is having his joke with us, but we will behave as if we did not notice it, so as not to offend him. But we shall obey in earnest no one but our present ruler, for not to do so would be a crime. And behind the departing sedan chair of the official there rises in might as ruler of the village some figure fortuitously exalted from an urn already crumbled to dust. Similarly, our people are but little affected by revolutions in the state or contemporary wars. I recall an incident in my youth. A revolt had broken out in a neighboring, but yet quite distant, province. What caused it I can no longer remember, nor is it of any importance now. Occasions for revolt can be found there any day. The people are an excitable people. Well, one day a leaflet published by the rebels was brought to my father's house by a beggar who had crossed that province. It happened to be a feast day, our rooms were filled with guests, the priest sat in the center and studied the sheet. Suddenly everybody started to laugh, in the confusion the sheet was torn, the beggar, who however had already received abundant alms, was driven out of the room with blows, the guests dispersed to enjoy the beautiful day. Why? The dialect of this neighboring province differs in some essential respects from ours, and this difference occurs also in certain turns of the written word, which for us have an archaic character. Hardly had the priest read 2 pages before we had come to our decision. Ancient history told long ago, old sorrows long since healed. And though, so it seems to me in recollection, the gruesomeness of the living present was irrefutably conveyed by the beggar's words, we laughed and shook our heads and refused to listen any longer. So eager are our people to obliterate the present. If from such appearances anyone should draw the conclusion that in reality we have no emperor, he would not be far from the truth. Over and over again it must be repeated. There is perhaps no people more faithful to the emperor than ours in the south, but the emperor derives no advantage from our fidelity. True, the sacred dragon stands on the little column at the end of our village, and ever since the beginning of human memory it has breathed out its fiery breath in the direction of Peking in token of homage. But Peking itself is far stranger to the people in our village than the next world. Can there really be a village where the houses stand side by side, covering all the fields for a greater distance than one can see from our hills, and can there be dense crowds of people packed between these houses day and night? We find it more difficult to picture such a city than to believe that Peking and its emperor are one, a cloud, say, peacefully voyaging beneath the sun in the course of the ages. Now the result of holding such opinions is a life on the whole free and unconstrained. By no means immoral, however, hardly ever have I found in my travels such pure morals as in my native village. But yet a life that is subject to no contemporary law, and attends only to the exhortations and warnings that come to us from olden times. I guard against generalizations, and do not assert that in all the 10,000 villages in my province it is so, far less in all the 500 provinces of China. Yet perhaps I may venture to assert on the basis of the many writings on this subject which I have read, as well as from my own observation, the building of the wall in particular, with its abundance of human material, provided a man of sensibility with the opportunity of traversing the souls of almost all the provinces. On the basis of all this, then, perhaps I may venture to assert that the prevailing attitude to the emperor shows persistently and universally something fundamentally in common with that of our village. Now I have no wish whatever to represent this attitude as a virtue, on the contrary. True, the essential responsibility for it lies with the government, which in the most ancient empire in the world has not yet succeeded in developing, or has neglected to develop, the institution of the empire to such precision that its workings extend directly and unceasingly to the farthest frontiers of the land. On the other hand, however, there is also involved a certain feebleness of faith and imaginative power on the part of the people, that prevents them from raising the empire out of its stagnation in Peking and clasping it in all its palpable living reality to their own breasts, which yet desire nothing better than but once to feel that touch and then to die. This attitude then is certainly no virtue. All the more remarkable is it that this very weakness should seem to be one of the greatest unifying influences among our people. Indeed, if one may dare to use the expression, the very ground on which we live. To set about establishing a fundamental defect here would mean undermining not only our consciences, but, what is far worse, our feet. And for that reason I shall not proceed any further at this stage with my inquiry into these questions. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The news of the building of the wall, a fragment. The news of the building of the wall now penetrated into this world, late, too, some 30 years after its announcement. It was on a summer evening. I, 10 years old, was standing with my father on the riverbank. In keeping with the importance of this much-discussed hour, I can recall the smallest details. My father was holding me by the hand, something he was fond of doing to the end of his days, and running his other hand up and down his long, very thin pipe, as though it were a flute. With his sparse, rigid beard raised in the air, he was enjoying his pipe while gazing upwards across the river. As a result his pigtail, object of the children's veneration, sank lower, rustling faintly on the gold-embroidered silk of his holiday gown. At that moment a bark drew up before us. The boatman beckoned to my father to come down the embankment, while he himself climbed up toward him. They met halfway. The boatman whispered something in my father's ear. In order to come quite close he had embraced him. I could not understand what they said. I only saw that my father did not seem to believe the news, that the boatman tried to insist upon its truth, that when my father still refused to believe it the boatman, with the passion of sailors, almost tore the garment from his chest to prove the truth, whereupon my father fell silent and the boatman jumped noisily into the bark and sailed away. Deep in thought my father turned toward me, knocked his pipe out and stuck it in his belt, stroked my cheek, and pulled my head toward him. That is what I liked best, it made me very happy, and so we came home. There the rice pap was already steaming on the table, several guests had assembled, the wine was just being poured into the goblets. Paying no attention to any of this and having advanced no farther than the threshold, my father started telling what he had heard. Of the exact words I have of course no recollection, but owing to the exceptional circumstances which cast a spell even over the child, the meaning became so clear to me that I venture nevertheless to give some version of what my father said. I am doing so because it was very characteristic of the popular point of view. My father said something like this: an unknown boatman, I know all those who usually pass by here, but this one was a stranger, has just told me that a great wall is going to be built to protect the emperor. For it seems that infidel tribes, among them demons, often assemble before the imperial palace and shoot their black arrows at the emperor. Translated by Tanya and James Stern. A report to an academy. Honored members of the academy, you have done me the honor of inviting me to give your academy an account of the life I formerly led as an ape. I regret that I cannot comply with your request to the extent you desire. It is now nearly 5 years since I was an ape, a short space of time, perhaps, according to the calendar, but an infinitely long time to gallop through at full speed, as I have done, more or less accompanied by excellent mentors, good advice, applause, and orchestral music, and yet essentially alone, since all my escorters, to keep the image, kept well off the course. I could never have achieved what I have done had I been stubbornly set on clinging to my origins, to the remembrances of my youth. In fact, to give up being stubborn was the supreme commandment I laid upon myself. Free ape as I was, I submitted myself to that yoke. In revenge, however, my memory of the past has closed the door against me more and more. I could have returned at first, had human beings allowed it, through an archway as wide as the span of heaven over the earth, but as I spurred myself on in my forced career, the opening narrowed and shrank behind me. I felt more comfortable in the world of men and fitted it better. The strong wind that blew after me out of my past began to slacken. Today it is only a gentle puff of air that plays around my heels. And the opening in the distance, through which it comes and through which I once came myself, has grown so small that, even if my strength and my willpower sufficed to get me back to it, I should have to scrape the very skin from my body to crawl through. To put it plainly, much as I like expressing myself in images, to put it plainly, your life as apes, gentlemen, insofar as something of that kind lies behind you, cannot be farther removed from you than mine is from me. Yet everyone on earth feels a tickling at the heels, the small chimpanzee and the great Achilles alike. But to a lesser extent I can perhaps meet your demand, and indeed I do so with the greatest pleasure. The first thing I learned was to give a handshake. A handshake betokens frankness. Well, today, now that I stand at the very peak of my career, I hope to add frankness in words to the frankness of that first handshake. What I have to tell the Academy will contribute nothing essentially new, and will fall far behind what you have asked of me, and what with the best will in the world I cannot communicate. Nonetheless, it should indicate the line an erstwhile ape has had to follow in entering and establishing himself in the world of men. Yet I could not risk putting into words even such insignificant information as I am going to give you if I were not quite sure of myself, and if my position on all the great variety stages of the civilized world had not become quite unassailable. I belong to the Gold Coast. For the story of my capture I must depend on the evidence of others. A hunting expedition sent out by the firm of Hagenbeck, by the way, I have drunk many a bottle of good red wine since then, with the leader of that expedition, had taken up its position in the bushes by the shore when I came down for a drink at evening among a troop of apes. They shot at us. I was the only one that was hit. I was hit in two places. Once in the cheek, a slight wound, but it left a large, naked, red scar which earned me the name of Red Peter, a horrible name, utterly inappropriate, which only some ape could have thought of, as if the only difference between me and the performing ape Peter, who died not so long ago and had some small local reputation, were the red mark on my cheek. This, by the way, the second shot hit me below the hip. It was a severe wound. It is the cause of my limping a little to this day. I read an article recently by one of the 10,000 windbags who vent themselves concerning me in the newspapers, saying, "My ape nature is not yet quite under control," the proof being that when visitors come to see me, I have a predilection for taking down my trousers to show them where the shot went in. The hand which wrote that should have its fingers shot away one by one. As for me, I can take my trousers down before anyone if I like. You would find nothing but a well-groomed fur and the scar made. Let me be particular in the choice of a word for this particular purpose, to avoid misunderstanding. The scar made by a wanton shot. Everything is open and above board. There is nothing to conceal. When the plain truth is in question, great minds discard the niceties of refinement. But if the writer of the article were to take down his trousers before a visitor, that would be quite another story, and I will let it stand to his credit that he does not do it. In return, let him leave me alone with his delicacy. After these two shots I came to myself, and this is where my own memories gradually begin, between decks in the Hagenbeck steamer, inside a cage. It was not a four-sided barred cage, it was only a three-sided cage nailed to a locker. The locker made the fourth side of it. The whole construction was too low for me to stand up in and too narrow to sit down in. So I had to squat with my knees bent and trembling all the time, and also, since probably for a time I wished to see no one, and to stay in the dark, my face was turned toward the locker while the bars of the cage cut into my flesh behind. Such a method of confining wild beasts is supposed to have its advantages during the first days of captivity, and out of my own experiences I cannot deny that from the human point of view this is really the case. But that did not occur to me then. For the first time in my life I could see no way out, at least no direct way out. Directly in front of me was the locker, board fitted close to board. True, there was a gap running right through the boards which I greeted with the blissful howl of ignorance when I first discovered it, but the hole was not even wide enough to stick one's tail through, and not all the strength of an ape could enlarge it. I am supposed to have made uncommonly little noise, as I was later informed, from which the conclusion was drawn that I would either soon die or if I managed to survive the first critical period would be very amenable to training. I did survive this period. Hopelessly sobbing, painfully hunting for fleas, apathetically licking a coconut, beating my skull against the locker, sticking out my tongue at anyone who came near me. That was how I filled in time at first in my new life. But over and above it all only the one feeling, no way out. Of course what I felt then as an ape I can represent now only in human terms, and therefore I misrepresent it, but although I cannot reach back to the truth of the old ape life, there is no doubt that it lies somewhere in the direction I have indicated. Until then I had had so many ways out of everything, and now I had none. I was pinned down. Had I been nailed down, my right to free movement would not have been lessened. Why so? Scratch your flesh raw between your toes, but you won't find the answer. Press yourself against the bar behind you till it nearly cuts you in two, you won't find the answer. I had no way out, but I had to devise one, for without it I could not live. All the time facing that locker, I should certainly have perished. Yet as far as Hagenbeck was concerned, the place for apes was in front of a locker. Well then, I had to stop being an ape. A fine, clear train of thought,